Thanks so much for showing up. The title of this talk is Sustainability at the Small Farm Level. I know that there's a lot of big growers present here, but I think smallholder farming and coffee is relevant to all of us. And I'll get to that, the reason behind that why, in a second. To begin with, I just want to say that the objective of this talk is to provide a general insight about sustainability at the small farm level and to get perspectives from people here as well. So we're going to do a talk, then we'll do a little session where you talk amongst each other, then you do feedback, and then we have a short general discussion. Because I think there's a lot of knowledge that's present here that can comment on a few things that I'll throw up and have a lot more interesting things to say as well. The photos for this talk, there will be no talking points at all, so you can relax. You don't need to read anything there. There's just some nice photos. All of them were actually taken by Pau, the photographer standing over there. He and I spent a long time in Colombia together last year, and we're putting some material together for sort of a photojournalistic perspective on smallholder coffee farming. So this will also be a way for us to show some of that material. We hope you like it. And I subsequently did a soil science project at a farm in Colombia that we worked at last year as well. So there'll be some of the things I learned there and some theoretical background as well. My own background is that I did a PhD a good handful of years ago in the energy and environment field, so I have some theoretical grounding in that. And then I've spent some time with coffee for the last couple of years and some other businesses, also traveling for coffee, meeting with farmers. We've also done that on this trip in Brazil, and hopefully continuing to do that for some years to come. It's a great experience. So I'll be talking now for about 20 minutes, then you'll get into groups for about 20 minutes, because I really want to hear from you, and I think you have a lot to share based on your own experience. Then we'll get your feedback, and then we'll have a final discussion. So to begin with, what do we really mean when we talk about sustainability? This is Alex and his son, and there's a house of a small coffee farmer from a farm nearby. Alex lives at a wet mill that we visited. He manages it, and he lives there with his family. The house belongs to a small coffee farmer that works with this wet mill. There's a lot of these small farmers where the three tenets of sustainability become really concrete questions. When we talk about sustainability, we're talking about 1, the natural environment, 2, social relations, and 3, the economic sphere. And these 3 areas very often overlap. At the farm level, we have some new landscaping taking place right there on the left side for a new farm. And Rafael standing there, kind of a strong guy, happy to do some of that farm work. He was one of the most outgoing persons that we met last year. What we talk about at the farm level is the importance we place on a number of different practical things. So we can talk about healthy soils, strong plants, and clean water. We can talk about high productivity and high quality coffee. We can talk about good infrastructure that connect the different farms with the wet mill, with the dry mill, etc. We can talk about properly trained farm managers. We can talk about access to skilled workers, strong and supportive relations across the entire supply chain, from small grower to wet mill to dry huller to exporter, importer, and so on, and the people who grade the coffee in between. We can talk about thriving farm communities that have a belief in the future of smallholder farming. And finally, we can talk about a level of income that incentivizes small farms to continue for the coming generation. A little pigeon there in a little home we visited. Alex carrying bananas. Coffee is an extremely relevant area to focus on when it comes to small farms and sustainability. Why? Globally, 25 million smallholder farms produce nearly 80% of the world's coffee. 80% with small farms. And in total, more than 100 million people globally work in coffee. In other words, there's numerous small farms with similar kinds of concerns all over the world. Coffee is the second most valuable commodity export from developing countries. I'm sure many of you know this. Following petroleum, it's an extremely valuable part of the global export. So in other words, coffee is a high volume commodity. And the future of Arabica coffee is threatened by global climate change, which I'm sure that many of us have heard a little bit about. Maybe some of you are already addressing it as farmers. So small farmers really need to think about now how they will adopt a strategy that will best prepare them for a changing climate. How can you think about the kinds of options available with tackling sustainability? We need to address the natural, the social, and economic sphere all at the same time. And to do that, we can sort of put our thinking into two general questions. Question of resilience and question of adaptation. One, how can small farmers become more resilient and reduce their vulnerabilities in the face of climate change? And secondly, how can small farmers best adapt when faced with new challenges? So resilience refers to the extent to which people, like farmers, are able to cope with new challenges. And it includes the following perspectives. Here we have some women pickers and men playing tejo. It's really just, I want you to really think about, when you think about resilience, the strength of communities coming together to find solutions also. So firstly, it's about minimizing your vulnerability to events like drought and rising temperatures. Secondly, it's that the relationship between poverty and wealth need to be thought about a lot. And the question of whether pouring money into a community, like a small farm cooperative, necessarily makes it more resilient, that's an important question. Just because you put a lot of money into a small farm community doesn't necessarily mean that it's being put to the right kind of use. Thirdly, the importance of participatory learning. Active farmers can share what they already know with one another. And fourth, how relations along the coffee supply chain between cooperatives, exporters, importers, and roasters can be reorganized to strengthen the resilience across the entire supply chain, so it doesn't just become the job of a single farmer standing alone. So I'm fairly, not advanced, but better than just patio drying raised bed facilities there that are also protected against the moisture and the dew, and pickers in the field on the right side. So resilience on the one hand, adaptation on the other. And adaptation refers to the ability of farmers to act and mobilize resources in response to new challenges. The kinds of challenges that might be relevant that we know are happening right now and will happen for the next 20, 30, 40 years include droughts and higher temperatures associated with climate change, the rise of plant pests and diseases, poor equipment and infrastructure, young people leaving farming for the cities. This is a major thing all over the world of coffee, as I'm sure many of you know. And volatile commodity and energy prices, and finally, changing market demands towards different types of varietals. So we should really try to address resilience and adaptation at the same time when looking at natural, social, and economic sustainability. But responses are going to be conditioned by the limitations of small-scale farms. So let's talk about that for a second. What are the limitations of small-scale farms relative to large farms, right? Because large farms and small farms face very different kinds of challenges. Large farms are able to work with economies of scale. You have larger volumes, you have lower prices. You have several coffee varietals to withstand disease and pest, and to diversify crops and respond to market demands. Large farms can invest in sophisticated machinery like state-of-the-art wet mills and warehousing. Large farms can invest in field and laboratory research. They can work with national universities. They can bring on researchers from farms. They can create specialized positions at the farm, and they can work with consultants. They can invest in sophisticated marketing and sales efforts globally. And this all means that they're generally much more resilient towards changes, and they have the resources to adapt when changes occur. Small farms are often family-operated ventures with just a couple of hectares. They're often working with supplemental sources of income next to coffee farming. They often have very limited knowledge of hybrid varietals and specialty market demands. They are often facing limited means of, they often have limited means of capital for investment in new infrastructure, new equipment on farms. And they have limited or no resources for research of any kind. And small farms looking to improve their resilience and adaptive capacity are therefore very dependent on support from cooperatives, exporters, roasters, and other stakeholders in the supply chain. So this all means that they're generally less resilient and they have fewer resources to adapt to changes. So here's some exotic varietals. And I'm putting the slide up here because let's say just because you're small, it doesn't mean that you can't make changes, right? That's the silver lining. And one example is the introduction of exotic varietals. As I'm sure many of you know, you've got geishas, SL28s, etc., that are being introduced by small farmers all over the world as different types of experiments. And it's therefore really important we think about national and regional differences and how that impacts the resilience and adaptive capacity of small farmers. Let's take Costa Rica and Ethiopia for a second. They build very different coffee production models from most large producing countries, including Brazil, where we are now, and Colombia. While specialty grade accounts for just 5% of global consumption, in Costa Rica and Ethiopia, coffee production is carried out primarily by smallholder farmers that produce specialty. And in Costa Rica, 80% of production is graded specialty. Farmers here enjoy good quality soil. They invest in good equipment on farms. The country generally has good infrastructure, and exporters help small farmers gain good market access. So that means the asking price is also relatively higher for these small farmers. And all these conditions, clearly, they're not easily replicated in other coffee-producing countries, but that doesn't mean that initiatives to strengthen resilience and adaptation cannot take hold. So let's talk a little more about the totally practical side on a farm. What are the environmental challenges that small farms face? On the left side, you've got a coffee tree that all the leaves are basically gone. It's been heavily attacked by varroa, and so photosynthesis can't really take place any longer. So you've got a lot of cherries there, but very likely you're going to have very poor quality. So what I'd like to point out is that a changing climate is increasingly affecting smallholder farmers. And that may be the greatest environmental and economic concern in small-scale coffee farming for many decades to come. Changes include high average soil surface temperature, droughts, and the spread of fungi and pests. The global production of coffee is likely going to reduce severely because of a series of connected activities of events that relate to these factors underlying climate change. So let me just give you a scenario of this, what this might look like based on what we already know that's happened. Think back to 1516, when a severe El Nino event took place, along with higher sea surface temperatures in the Pacific Ocean, which together led to coffee farms across Latin America, Africa, and Asia suffering heat spells, droughts, flooding, wildfires, and ultimately severe crop losses. Plants that face higher temperature stresses were less able to produce high-quality cherries, and they became more susceptible to fungi such as coffee leaf rust. Because average sea surface temperatures are continuing to rise, it's very likely that more severe weather phenomena like the severe El Nino event we saw in 1516 is going to affect farmers in the tropical zone in decades to come. It's going to place stress on production volumes and quality, and it's going to reduce the supply of Arabica coffee worldwide. Smaller farms have less flexibility when they respond to climate change because they have poor access to capital and their personal finances are often tied up with the farm. So when these small farms shift their production away from Arabica coffee towards more climate resilient crops like cacao, maize, and rice, the global supply may again be reduced even more. This means we should be concerned with the ways that climate change in turn erodes resilient and adaptive capacity of small farms. What changes to farming practices are possible when faced with these types of environmental challenges? There are some general concerns and options I'd like for you to think about when you talk amongst yourselves in groups. You may have a lot of experience with lots of different farming techniques that we're not going to talk about today, and I hope that you will discuss them in your groups as well and give some feedback. How do we best address challenges and opportunities at the same time? I think that's a central question of small farmers. The one major challenge I've talked about so far is that the climate is changing, and farmers at all scales need to adapt and strengthen their resilience. The second is the opportunity of higher priced varietals, right? So we've got coffee leaf rust having destroyed the plant here on the left side entirely, and on the right side, the introduction of exotic varietals. And added value processes like controlled fermentation, more stable drying, etc. So one major question is, how do you prioritize that one major challenge and those new opportunities for small-scale farmers that only have so many resources, right? They can't do everything all at once. Second, if we focus on management practices for healthier soils, more resilient plants, and farmland that's better adapted to the impacts of climate change, there are a number of options available. We can use abundant shade trees in polyculture and agroforestry systems. Shade trees reduce temperature stress, they retain moisture in soils, and they support rich microbial activity in soils. Intercropping with shade trees can also produce temperature and drought-resilient crops in between the coffee trees as an additional source of income. An example of intercropping is cacao trees that we heard about earlier today. Cacao trees are more climate resilient, and you see farmers at lower elevations all over the world switching to them. The question is, do they need to switch wholesale, or can they introduce things like cacao next to coffee to diversify their income? Third, landscaping with large trees can reduce soil erosion in hilly landscapes and help reduce the devastating effects of flooding. So far I've really just talked about planting new trees and the benefits of that if you plant it well. Composting can be done on site at farms or at composting stations that are managed by cooperatives. Collection of organic fertilizers like manure from nearby farms can also be managed by cooperatives. And cover crops can be introduced to protect the topsoil from drought, from scorching temperatures, and from erosion. The last thing I'm going to talk about is something called biochar, because I have a theoretical and practical experience with that. So like I said at the beginning, I did a controlled experiment last year. We did a soil science experiment in field that's still ongoing, and data is being collected on it, where we use biochar to change the soil together with composting and with fertilizers. Biochar is the use of charred organic matter. It's similar to charcoal, which many of you know if you've done farming, has a lot of different benefits. But it's gasified at between 400 and 700 degrees Celsius with low oxygen intake, and it has a lot of different benefits that charcoal doesn't have. It can be mixed with compost and fertilizer to enrich the microbial and fungal activity in the topsoil. It can help retain moisture at low depths, and it can function as a natural protection against drought. So all of these options and others that I haven't talked about, they can be assessed for their impact at small farms. You can look at the impact on yield by looking at kilograms of cherry produced per tree. You can look at the impact on farmers' incomes by looking at the increased income per unit of land, and you can look at the impact on carbon emissions by looking at the life cycle analysis of greenhouse emissions like CO2, nitrogen, and methane. To do all of this, we also need to think about the changing social practices, right? So now we talked a little bit about environmental challenges and opportunities. Let's talk about the social sphere for a second and sustainability there. Can we think of better ways to structure formal relations between farmers, like the woman on the right, cooperatives? We've got a picture from a cooperative we visited on the left side here that has some equipment that hundreds of farmers come and use on a regular basis, and exporters, such as some of the people present here today, like Ally. It's very challenging for farm commodity products to change social relations around the world because many formal relations are often highly regulated in producing countries. But for specialty, there's often a great deal more flexibility and stakeholders are smaller. So I think that's where it's more relevant to focus also. Incentives between different stakeholders are often not aligned because farmers need to think about the long term. Cooperatives can become stale and leadership can become ineffective. And exporters, importers, and roasters can change their buying patterns year after year. One alternative is to create more flexibility for farmers, allowing them to negotiate independently alongside cooperatives and create long-term relations with exporters and roasters with contractual obligations to improve quality by investing a fixed premium annually in farm infrastructure. That kind of approach would allow small farmers to think more about long-term improvements while reducing the risk that capital investments become stranded assets. That's one area we can think about. We can also think about a much earlier stage. Here we have a picture of a schoolyard. We visited the school and a program they were involved in. And the main question here is, can we change education to support a better understanding of specialty farming from an early age? That's what we see happening at this school, and it's happening at others as well, with the engagement of agronomists. These girls and others are involved in targeted programs where older school children and young producers want to move from commodity to specialty. These girls were working at plots at their school, but they also had plots at home where they were taking charge of some of the coffee production aside from what their parents were doing. And that allows them to think from an early age about what the difference is between good coffee and even better coffee. Experienced agronomists have likewise taken up a supportive role in the management of the school's own program, and they're helping the teachers there have a better understanding of farming techniques, and hopefully they and some exporters can get involved with cupping as well. One thing is farming, but we all know that farmers need to understand that exporters and roasters are looking for something that's high quality coffee at the end of the day. How about established farmers? Small farmers often have very limited knowledge of alternative approaches to farming. They've been doing the same thing sometimes for decades. And agricultural consultants are usually quite expensive and off limits to them. So can we think of economic and flexible approaches to farmer training initiatives? Formal exchanges with farmers from other regions could be developed with the help of exporters. Cooperatives and exporters could expand this model and create formal exchange programs with regular data collection by farmers and create online learning modules and tutorials. The thing is, when you travel around, you notice that people are quite different from each other, but nearly everyone has access to internet. So there's huge scope there for creating formal learning. And a cadre of local farming leaders could be trained in a structured program with the aim of having them train other farmers in the same way. That's what you call training of trainers, and it's been tested around the world for different kinds of crops. And it can be focused on alternative farming techniques alongside rigorous data collection. Let's talk finally about changes to economic structures. Here we have coffee being sold at a small, it's a small buyer, and it's a mix of some specialty grade and some commodity. And that's the kind of buying reality that a lot of small farmers, buying and selling reality that a lot of small farmers have access to. That's it, that's all they see a lot of the time. Do we need new financing options for small coffee farmers? We could think about coffee farm bonds, similar to green bonds. Green bonds are usually structured as long-term, short-interest bonds for corporate social responsibility portfolios, and they're focused on the renewables sector and on infrastructure that's low carbon. So conceptually speaking, it's not very far from that to think about farming that's done in a more sustainable way as well. We could also think about joint stock companies that could be formed to invest in farms with combined ownership in several small individual farms. And we could think about loans that could be secured against future coffee production volumes at fixed prices and earmarked for infrastructure investments. And in fact, a lot of this stuff is already done in an informal way across many different stakeholders, but there's nothing stopping us from formalizing it more. Let's talk about insurance for a second, because a lot of people are going to face a lot more challenges with farming for decades to come, again, because of climate change and other challenges. So is insurance today adequate when we think about the problems that we're facing today and going to be facing? Traditional insurance requires highly specific information and may involve cheating, what's known as moral hazard, on the part of the insured. So there's an alternative to traditional insurance that's being implemented all around the world, specifically for farmers, and it's called index-based insurance. And index-based insurance relies on weather information that's being indexed based on rainfall and temperature monitoring to determine whether a specific weather-related type of event has occurred and whether a payment is due. So very simply, if the data says that some event has taken place, like a severe temperature change or a flooding, then a payment is made to the farmer regardless of the damage that's happened to the farm. Index-based insurance is therefore a way of streamlining, simplifying, and expanding insurance cover to many small farmers who would otherwise not be considered eligible for insurance. Here's Alex at the wet mill. So in theory, these differences in insurance allow more farmers to access the insurance market and allow payments to be made more easily. And that's a major thing for small farmers to think about. They need to hedge their bets all the time. They just have a few hectares to do that at. And one way to make this a reality is to use more mobile data collection at farm level. We could think about cell phones. We could think about cheap sensors all around small farms. In fact, this is already done, but it's done at larger farms usually, or small farms that are niche farms, like organic farms, where these sensors pick up on rainfall and moisture, etc. And that can easily be combined with index-based insurance. And an example of this is the ACRA program in East Africa, which aims to insure 3 million small farmers by next year, by 2018. So it's already taking place in different parts of the world, and we can definitely expand it. Finally, I just want to talk about certification and premium pricing as part of this economic question. We know fair trade, we know organic, we know Rainforest Alliance, and we know other types of certification pay farmers a premium for specialty coffee. With fair trade, farmers receive a minimum price and a premium for organic coffees. The minimum price is currently $1.35 per pound FOB and $1.65 per pound FOB for organic coffees. In 2014, there were over 800,000 certified fair trade coffee farmers worldwide,